For a long time, I believed that my problems would disappear if I didn't look at them too closely. I didn't run away in obvious ways. I didn't quit my job or cut people out of my life suddenly. Instead, I learned how to avoid quietly. I postponed conversations. I distracted myself with work. I filled my days with activity so there would be no space left for discomfort. From the outside, my life looked stable. I was responsible. I showed up when I was needed. I did what was expected of me. People trusted me to handle things, and I rarely disappointed them in visible ways. Because of that, I told myself everything was under control. Inside, though, there was a constant tension, a feeling that I was always holding something back. Whenever a problem appeared, whether it was a mistake, a conflict, or an uncomfortable emotion, I felt the same reaction rise in me. A tightness in my chest, a desire to delay, a hope that if I waited long enough, the problem would solve itself. Avoidance became my habit, not because I was lazy, but because I was afraid. Afraid of being judged, afraid of disappointing others, afraid of admitting that I didn't always know what to do. I believed that facing problems meant exposing weakness, and weakness felt dangerous. So I became skilled at looking fine. If something went wrong at work, I told myself it wasn't serious. If a relationship felt strained, I convinced myself it was just temporary. If I felt overwhelmed, I pushed the feeling aside and focused on something practical. I didn't deny problems existed. I simply refused to stay with them long enough to understand them. This way of living worked for a while. My days were full. My schedule was busy. I rarely had time to sit quietly and reflect. When I did, I felt uneasy. Silence made space for thoughts I didn't want to face. So I avoided silence. English during this period was very far away, not because I thought it was impossible, but because it represented something I wasn't ready to face. Learning English would mean being a beginner again, making mistakes out loud, not understanding, asking for help, all the things I was carefully avoiding in other areas of my life. I told myself English wasn't necessary. I had enough to manage already, enough pressure, enough responsibility. Learning a new language felt like inviting more uncertainty into a life that already felt heavy, but the truth was simpler. English made me uncomfortable for the same reason my problems did. It forced me to slow down, to notice gaps, to accept imperfection. And imperfection felt like failure to me. I believed that if I stayed competent, if I stayed useful, if I stayed reliable, then I would be safe. So I avoided anything that challenged that image. English quietly waited in the background, representing all the things I didn't want to feel. Over time, avoidance stopped feeling like a choice. It became automatic. I reacted before thinking. I delayed before deciding. I hoped before acting. And slowly, without realizing it, my problems grew, not dramatically, quietly. Small issues became heavier because they were never addressed. Minor misunderstandings turned into distance. Simple mistakes created unnecessary stress. I didn't see this clearly at the time. I only felt tired, not tired of work, but tired of carrying things alone. There were moments, usually late at night, when I felt a strange mix of anxiety and emptiness. I would ask myself why everything felt harder than it should. I never answered that question honestly. I told myself I was just stressed, just busy, just human. I didn't realize that avoiding problems doesn't remove them. It only removes your ability to deal with them calmly. Still, I continued this way because it felt familiar, because it felt safer than change, because facing problems felt like standing in bright light without protection. English remained distant, not as a language, but as a mirror I refused to look into. I didn't know yet that one ordinary moment, quiet, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore, would force me to stop running. I didn't know yet that avoiding my problems was costing me far more than facing them ever could. For now, I kept moving, kept postponing, kept convincing myself that later would be easier, and later, I believed, would eventually come. The moment that finally slowed me down did not arrive with drama. There was no argument, no public failure, no sudden collapse. It came quietly, in a situation so ordinary that I almost missed it. And maybe that was the reason it stayed with me. It was a small problem at work, nothing serious. Something that could have been resolved with a short conversation if I had addressed it early. Instead, I delayed. I told myself I would handle it later, when I had more time, when I felt calmer, when the situation felt clearer. Later, as usual, did not come. The problem grew slightly. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to create discomfort. I felt it in my chest every time I thought about it. I avoided checking messages. I avoided starting the conversation. I stayed busy, hoping the issue would soften on its own. It didn't. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone, staring at my screen without reading anything. My body felt heavy. My thoughts felt tangled. For the first time, I noticed how much energy I had been spending just to avoid one simple conversation. That realization stopped me. I wasn't afraid of the problem itself. I was afraid of the feeling it brought up. The feeling of not being in control. The feeling of possibly being wrong. The feeling of having to admit that I hadn't handled things well. That fear felt familiar. I recognized it from many other moments in my life. Times when I postponed decisions. Times when I stayed silent instead of asking questions. Times when I chose comfort over clarity. Avoidance had been my strategy for years, and it had always felt like the safer option. But sitting there, tired and stuck, it suddenly felt expensive. I began to see how avoidance didn't remove difficulty. It multiplied it. The longer I waited, the heavier the problem became. Not because the situation worsened, but because my imagination filled the gaps. I created scenarios that never happened. I carried stress that wasn't necessary. That was when English crossed my mind again. Not as a subject, not as a skill, as a pattern. Learning English had always felt uncomfortable for the same reason facing problems did. It required me to stay with confusion instead of escaping it, to admit I didn't know, to move forward without guarantees. I realized that I wasn't avoiding English because of time or ability. I was avoiding it because it demanded the same courage I was avoiding everywhere else. That realization was uncomfortable, but it was also clear. I finally addressed the problem at work. The conversation I had feared for days lasted less than 10 minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And when it ended, I felt something unexpected, relief, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped running. That relief stayed with me. It showed me how much unnecessary weight I had been carrying. How often I had chosen avoidance without questioning its cost. How often I had mistaken delay for protection. I began to wonder how many other parts of my life were shaped by the same pattern. English was one of them. I didn't suddenly decide to change everything. I didn't promise myself I would become fearless, but I made one small decision. I decided to stop avoiding English in the same quiet way I had been avoiding problems, not to master it, not to study seriously, just to stay. I started listening to English stories again, slowly, casually, without pressure to understand everything. When I felt confused, I didn't stop. When I felt uncomfortable, I didn't distract myself. I stayed a little longer. That staying felt similar to the relief I had felt after the difficult conversation. Not comfortable, but lighter. As if something inside me had loosened. I began to notice how often I wanted to escape discomfort. How quickly I reached for distraction. How automatic my avoidance had become. English gave me a place to practice something different. I practiced staying with confusion, staying with imperfection, staying with uncertainty. Some days it felt pointless. Some days it felt calming. But it always felt honest. I realized that courage was not about dramatic action. It was about not turning away, about staying present long enough to see what was actually there. The more I practiced this with English, the more I noticed it spreading into other areas of my life. I paused before reacting. I delayed less. I addressed small problems sooner. Not perfectly, but sooner. Avoidance had once felt like safety. Now it felt like a habit I no longer needed. English was no longer just a language in the background of my life. It had become a quiet teacher, showing me how to face discomfort without being overwhelmed by it. I didn't feel brave, but I felt awake, and that was new. As I continued to stay instead of escaping, I began to notice how deeply avoidance had shaped my inner world. It wasn't just about delaying problems or difficult conversations. It was about how I related to discomfort in general. Whenever something felt unclear, unfinished, or emotionally heavy, my instinct was always the same. Move away, distract, postpone. Now, slowly, that instinct was being questioned. Staying with English became a daily reminder of this shift. Each time I didn't understand a sentence, each time I felt lost in meaning, I had a choice. I could close the video and return to something familiar, or I could stay a little longer, even if nothing became clearer right away. At first, staying felt unnatural. My body reacted before my mind did. A slight tension in my shoulders, a restlessness in my chest, a quiet urge to do something else. I noticed these reactions without trying to fix them. I didn't judge them. I simply observed. That observation itself felt like progress. I began to realize that discomfort had always arrived before growth, but I had rarely allowed it to stay long enough to do its work. I had treated discomfort as a warning sign, something to avoid, rather than a signal that something new was forming. English slowly changed that interpretation. I noticed how confusion did not harm me. It didn't break my focus. It didn't damage my sense of self. It simply existed, asking for patience. And when I gave it patience, it softened on its own. This realization began to affect how I approached my emotions. When I felt anxious, I didn't immediately explain it away. When I felt frustrated, I didn't rush to justify it. I stayed with those feelings a little longer, listening instead of reacting. That listening revealed patterns. I saw how often my avoidance was driven by fear of judgment, fear of being seen as incapable, fear of disappointing others. I had spent years protecting myself from these fears by staying silent, by staying busy, by staying safe. English offered me a different way. In that space, mistakes were expected. Hesitation was normal. Imperfection was not punished. That environment allowed me to experiment with being unfinished. I started to notice small shifts in my daily life. When a problem appeared, I felt less urgency to run from it. I didn't solve everything immediately, but I acknowledged issues sooner. I named things quietly, even if I didn't yet know how to handle them. Conversations changed to I listened more, I interrupted less. I allowed pauses to exist without filling them. Silence no longer felt threatening. It felt like space where meaning could surface. There were still moments when I avoided. I didn't become someone else overnight. Old habits returned, especially when I felt tired or overwhelmed. But now, I noticed when it happened, and noticing changed everything. Instead of criticizing myself, I asked simple questions. What am I avoiding right now? What feels uncomfortable? What would happen if I stayed just a little longer? Often, the answers were less frightening than I expected. English continued to reflect this process back to me. The more I stayed, the less dramatic learning felt. It became ordinary, repetitive, quiet, and through that quiet repetition, something stable began to form. I realized that courage wasn't loud. It didn't arrive as confidence or bold action. It arrived as presence, as the willingness to remain with something unfinished. That insight stayed with me. I stopped waiting to feel ready before engaging. Whether it was English, a conversation, or a decision I had delayed, I allowed myself to begin without certainty. I accepted that clarity often comes after movement, not before it. This didn't make life easier, but it made it more honest. I felt less divided inside, less torn between what I was doing and what I was avoiding. The energy I had once spent running away became available for attention. I didn't feel fearless, but I felt grounded, grounded enough to stay, grounded enough to listen, grounded enough to face small discomforts before they turned into larger ones. English was no longer a distant language, waiting for the right moment. It had become a daily practice of staying present, of allowing confusion, of trusting that understanding would come in its own time. And through that practice, I began to see myself differently, not as someone who avoided problems, but as someone learning how to face them gently. That shift didn't announce itself. It didn't change everything at once, but it prepared me for the final realization. One that would not come from effort, but from reflection. One that would quietly reshape how I lived long after this story ended. Looking back now, I understand that the most important changes in my life did not come from dramatic decisions. They came from small moments of honesty. Moments when I stopped pretending that avoiding discomfort was protecting me. I used to believe that strength meant being able to handle everything quietly, that asking questions showed weakness, that admitting confusion made me less capable. For a long time, I built my identity around being reliable, calm, and unaffected. But beneath that surface, I was tired, tired of postponing conversations, tired of carrying unspoken tension, tired of living in a way that required constant avoidance. What changed was not my circumstances. It was my relationship with discomfort. I stopped treating it as an enemy. I stopped seeing it as something to escape from. I began to see it as information. Discomfort was telling me where attention was needed, where honesty was missing, where growth was quietly waiting. English played an unexpected role in this realization. It never demanded perfection. It simply asked me to show up, to stay with confusion, to accept being incomplete. Over time, I realized that this was not just a language lesson, it was a life lesson. I learned that clarity rarely arrives before action. It comes after you are willing to engage, after you are willing to speak, even when your voice feels uncertain, after you are willing to listen, even when you don't yet understand. This understanding changed how I approached my life. I stopped waiting for the right moment to begin. I stopped believing that readiness was something you feel. I began to see readiness as something you practice. I practiced it in small ways, by addressing issues sooner, by asking questions I once avoided, by staying in conversations that felt uncomfortable. I didn't become fearless. Fear still appears. Doubt still shows up. But they no longer control my decisions. I no longer organize my life around avoiding them. English remains part of this practice, not because I need it to succeed, but because it reminds me to slow down, to think before speaking, to stay present even when my words are imperfect. I no longer measure progress by confidence. I measure it by honesty, by how often I am willing to stay instead of escape, by how quickly I return to presence when I notice myself drifting away. Avoidance once felt safe. Now it feels expensive. Facing discomfort does not make life easier, but it makes it lighter. It frees energy that was once trapped in hesitation. It creates space for connection, for clarity, for meaning. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself in these words, I want to tell you something gently. You are not behind. You are not weak. And you are not failing. You may simply be avoiding something that deserves your attention. You don't need to change everything at once. You don't need to be brave in dramatic ways. You only need to stay a little longer in moments you usually escape. That is where understanding begins. That is where confidence quietly forms. That is where growth happens without forcing. English, like life, does not ask you to be perfect. It asks you to participate, to remain open, to accept that not knowing is part of learning. I still move slowly. I still hesitate sometimes, but I no longer confuse hesitation with failure. I see it as a pause, a moment to choose presence over avoidance. And that choice, repeated gently, has changed everything. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this: avoidance keeps you safe in the short term. Presence frees you in the long term. You don't need to stop being afraid. You only need to stop running, quietly, one moment at a time.